Hello, everyone. So my talk is titled The Empirical Stance Revisited, What's So Special About Epistemology? So in this talk, I focus on stance empiricism, an approach to empiricism championed by Bas van Fraassen that views empiricism as a stance rather than a doctrine or a dogma. I note that debates about this in the literature have almost exclusively been about epistemology. And here I want to propose that we take non-epistemological stances, or rather epistemic stances for non-epistemological reasons or purposes, seriously. I want to ultimately advocate for a stance pluralism, not the kind that Van Fraassen's voluntarism seems to automatically sanction, but a more robust kind of pluralism. So in the empirical stance, Van Fraassen seeks to present a new empiricism. A key motivation for Van Fraassen here is to come up with an empiricism that's not self-defeating. Traditional empiricism, or naive empiricism, as Van Fraassen calls it, takes empiricism to be a doctrine, typically something like experience is the sole source of factual information. Simply put, the problem is that such a doctrine is itself metaphysical and not based on experience. To resolve this, Van Fraassen proposes that empiricism should be seen as a stance rather than as a doctrine or dogma. Since the book was written, there has been vigorous debate in the literature on what exactly a stance is. As a first approximation, a stance can be thought of as an interrelated web of values, commitments, emotions, attitudes, aims, strategies, and beliefs. So it isn't just propositional attitudes, although beliefs can be part of it. A stance has been interpreted variously as an epistemic guide, or a policy or a framework, among other things. So for instance, Paul Teller and Peter Lipton have looked at stances as epistemic policies, and Peter Baumann has looked at it as framework. So an empiricist, so here we don't have to get into the finer distinctions between these various interpretations of stances. An empiricist stance in particular can be characterized as one that doesn't view explanation by postulation, or an explanation in general, favorably, and has a general disdain for metaphysics, an austere attitude toward ontology, and calls us back to experience and shows a general admiration for science. The disagreement between empiricism and metaphysics is no longer one of doctrines. It is of stances. The disagreement between the empiricist and metaphysical stances is one of values, aims, and attitudes. How do we then adjudicate among stances? Van Fraassen has two minimal criteria. First, a stance should be rational in the sense of being internally coherent. It shouldn't lead to self-sabotage by its own lights. Any stance that satisfies this criterion is considered rational. This is a permissive account of rationality. A stance is permissible as long as it is internally coherent. And second, our values decide our choice of stance. Of course, values are relative to an agent, and in this sense, are not objective. Van Fraassen advances a voluntarist epistemology according to which there is an element of choice in adopting epistemological stances, and rationality underdetermines our choice of stance. While my values guide me to adopt a certain epistemological stance, I cannot rule a contrary stance as irrational as long as it is self-coherent. So this has naturally led to allegations of relativism. If rationality doesn't compel us to adopt a stance, and if we are to be voluntarists about epistemological stances, then we seem to have to conclude that all stances that aren't internally incoherent are equally acceptable, unless we have some uniform or universal meta-level criteria for choice of values or emotions and attitudes, but that would go against the very spirit of voluntarism. Stance empiricism is epistemically irrational in Jonathan Reed Survival's terms, in the sense of being immune to epistemic reason. So what do we do? The stance empiricist has two options at this point: accept relativism, but this would mean that the stance empiricist cannot criticize other opposing stances, or find a way out of such a relativism. Van Fraassen seems to lean more toward the second option. He's at pains to argue that while there is relativism here, we don't end up with some kind of a crippling relativism. He comments, if this is relativism, it is certainly not debilitating relativism. It is only an acknowledgement of the logic of this aspect of the human condition. Martin Cush reasonably interprets this to mean that this quote of Van Fraassen that says that it's not a debilitating relativism. So Martin Cush reasonably interprets that to mean that this kind of relativism is not one that doesn't allow a stance holder to judge or argue. This is reminiscent of Thomas Kuhn's view on theory choice in Objectivity, Value Judgment, and Theory Choice, where he argues that theory choice is a matter of judgment involving individual or personal factors, as well as shared common criteria, and that judgments, as opposed to mere tastes or preferences, are eminently discussable. How do we discuss stances? An empiricist could say to a scientific realist, as Van Fraassen does, things like belief in unobservable entities is supererogatory. It's more than what you're compelled to do rationally. Or as Cartwright does, we are creatures bound in a world of sensation, and so on. It is certainly very possible that two people adopting opposing stances have some meta shared background values or beliefs on the basis of which such discussions could be meaningful and might even result in conversion, to use Van Fraassen's term. But importantly, Van Fraassen's point is that even if that doesn't happen for whatever reason, we still don't have to buy into the opposing stance. While the rationality criterion may rule it out for us, while the rationality criterion may not rule it out for us, our values do. In fact, Van Fraassen goes further to say, to take a stance is ipso facto to rule out all competitors as stances for oneself. And this ruling out apparently is done on the basis of one's values. He says he's not advocating any general principle of tolerance here. But doesn't this just push the relativism back one step? Now it seems to be a relativism of values or commitments or whatever it is that Van Fraassen takes to be prior to stances. So Anjan Chakravarti has argued that a relativism of values and hence stances is unavoidable. He claims that philosophy, unlike science, isn't a consensus demanding discipline by nature, at least not to the extent of science, and that while there has been progress in the sense of moving from one well-accepted view to another within stances, there has relatively been little progress towards some kind of stance convergence. So as an example, the realism or anti-realism or metaphysics empiricism debates are well and alive. So for instance, while we moved away from falsifiability as a criterion for demarcating science from pseudoscience, that you can look at that as progress from one view to another view, that's still within a certain stance. There's been, way less progress in terms of a convergence of stances, is Chakravarti's point. In agreement with Van Fraassen, Chakravarti argues that stance choice is also not amenable to be studied by a natural or social science. The will is utterly impervious to theoretical analysis, and yet we simply cannot do without it here, he says. He then argues that our stances are so deeply connected to our background values and commitments that if pushed to justify a choice of stance or why we do things the way we do, we'll just have to say, this is simply what I do. So Chakravarti's response is to embrace the relativism. But to be clear, though, his choice of stance is the metaphysical or ontological one that is continuous with science and not a speculative metaphysics. But that stems from his values and commitments. And as I understand it, he has no reasons on epistemic or rational grounds to criticize other stances. So this is a point I will be returning to. So although he has no rational grounds to criticize other stances, he still adopts his stance, which is the scientific metaphysical one, based on his values. Rees-Sorreville's approach is to deny relativism even more strongly. He says, even more strongly compared to Van Fraassen. He says, so Van Fraassen does not deny that stances are epistemically irrational, but he denies that this is a problem. So in his view, the possibility of debate on the basis of shared values provides a model of stance disagreement that is adequate for empiricist purposes. Rees-Sorreville, on the other hand, purports to give a teleological argument that stances are not epistemically irrational. There are 3 steps to the argument. First, we live in a world of sensations. Evolutionary biology has explained the development of reliable sense perception in humans. There is a lack of connection between the contents of our brains and a priori intuitions, and also a lack of evolutionary explanation of how the human brain might have evolved to track a priori intuitions. Second, based on this first step, an empirical stance is more likely to advance an epistemic goal compared to a rationalist or a metaphysical stance. So in other words, owing to the fact that we live in a world of sensations, owing to the fact that evolutionary biology has explained the development of reliable sense perceptions in humans, and owing to the fact that there seems to be a disconnect between the way our brains have evolved and owing to the fact that we don't seem to have good reason for believing that we're able to accurately latch on to a priori intuitions, it seems that an empirical stance is more likely to help us achieve an epistemic goal. And hence, conclusion, we should take up an empirical stance. What is an epistemic goal here? Rees-Sorreville cites Richard Feldman's pragmatic approach. We play different roles, such as a teacher or parent, etc., and we have different goals relative to these roles. Quote, according to Feldman, one of our roles, qua cognizers, is to form beliefs in response to evidence and on the basis of reflection, end quote. To say that our epistemic goal is to phi is to say that by phi-ing, we would do what is required or recommended by the cognitive role we're playing. And regarding the kind of beliefs we should form in response to evidence, he seems to have a pretty standard view of forming true or epistemically justified beliefs. And finally, insofar as an empirical stance is well suited to epistemic goals, it is not considered irrational. Lots can be said and asked here, but I resist. This was just to give you a taste of the debates around stances in the relevant literature over the last 2 decades. This is obviously not exhaustive, but I think a good representation of the literature for my present purposes. Notice that no matter what the stance is, they all focus exclusively on pure epistemology. All the debate is, at the end of the day, about epistemological stances. Although the epistemological enterprise is itself seen as pragmatic by Feldman and Rees-Sorreville, for instance, and also Van Fraassen, I think, especially when he's talking about voluntarism. It is worth noting that other pragmatic goals haven't been of interest. Also, all of these authors are implicitly monistic about their own stance choice. We have seen that although it might seem that voluntarism paves the way for full-blown relativism and hence pluralism of stances, Van Fraassen doesn't really take this route. At the end of the day, he sticks to his guns and remains an empiricist. And I believe the same can be said about Chakravarti's metaphysical stance. I should note that Van Fraassen and presumably Chakravarti does allow for the possibility of stance conversion, propelled by emotion, among other things. And so in this sense, may be interpreted as a minimal pluralist, if we want to call fallibilists as pluralists. But they're not pluralists in the more robust sense of the term. So Van Fraassen says, quote, engaging in philosophy and engaging in the practice that we're philosophizing about are not at all the same, end quote. He then goes on to distinguish between an empirical stance and an empiricist stance. While the former, that is an empirical stance, according to him, refers to the stance of a practicing empirical scientist, the latter, that is the empiricist stance, refers to a philosophical stance regarding science. He notes that while scientists routinely work within an empirical stance in the sense of an empiricist, while scientists routinely work within an empirical stance in the sense of an epistemic policy, and even cites scientific papers using the phrase empirical stance while having nothing to do with a philosophical view of science. An empiricist philosophical position, on the other hand, has a lot more to it than an empirical epistemic policy. And so actually he notes here that the title of his book should have probably been the empiricist stance and not the empirical stance. I take it that Van Fraassen brings up this distinction between philosophical and non-philosophical policies or positions to drive home the point that people in various walks of life might have certain unreflective epistemic policies that don't qualify as philosophical positions or stances, and that his focus in this discussion is exclusively philosophical stances as opposed to other ordinary ones. Fair enough. However, he seems to implicitly equate in this context philosophy to epistemology for its own sake, and a philosophical stance to a purely epistemological one. Quote, while an empiricist philosopher will have a characteristic epistemological stance, that is not at all the same as having an epistemic stance. The most concise way to indicate the empiricist tradition's tendencies in epistemology is once again to point to the sorts of metaphysics it rejects, end quote. Of course, there are non-epistemological stances. Moral stances immediately come to mind, but that is not the kind of distinction I'm drawing here. I'm talking about an epistemic stances in the sense Van Fraassen uses the term here, and epistemological stances adopted for goals that are ultimately not purely epistemological. Can these be philosophical stances too? So in response to the question, what is the point of reflection and philosophy? Simon Blackburn identifies a high ground, a middle ground, and a low ground response. The high ground response is that reflection is good for its own sake, even if it is far removed from everyday practice. The middle ground response is that reflection is continuous with practice and influences it, and the low ground response is just an even stronger version of the middle ground response. And it's the idea that reflection is sometimes so, very strongly, intimately bound with everyday practice. In philosophy of science, I roughly think of philosophers of science and practice and socially engaged philosophers as working more in the middle ground, and various practitioners, scientists, science policymakers, science teachers, working more in the low ground. And of course, epistemologists of science, I think, are certainly high up there in the high ground. I think philosophy isn't a natural kind, and I think it's a mistake to equate a philosophical stance to an epistemology for its own sake kind of stance. So I invite philosophers to adopt a meta stance of pragmatism and pluralism toward philosophical or epistemological goals and stances. So Let's talk about pragmatism and pluralism about stances. We can talk about a pluralism within the high ground itself, that is, within the epistemology for its own sake. Within that itself, we can talk about a pluralism. So, for instance, embracing both empiricism and realism with respect to different goals, right? So that would be sort of pluralism in the high ground. Stathis Sillas, for instance, has advanced a new, relatively new, and a very pragmatic approach to scientific realism. Similar to Van Fraassen, he sees realism not as a doctrine, but a framework, and a framework in whose adoption we have a choice. He argues that relative to certain aims, the framework is indispensable. What are those aims? Achieving causal and nomological coherence in our image of the world, and for offering cogent explanations of the behavior of gross objects, is what he says. But if you have other goals, you're free to not choose the realist framework. I'm not sure that Van Fraassen frames his view on the empiricist stance this way. He doesn't talk about the empiricist stance being good for a particular goal. In fact, as several scholars have noted, he never gives a reason for why we're better off adopting an empiricist stance than a metaphysical one. All he does is sort of express his distaste for the latter. But anyway, my goal is to focus a little more on the low and middle grounds with a few examples. Let's consider a science or medical advisor holding a position in government. There's a vaccine hesitancy crisis. Now, this is a situation where an empirical stance is going to make the most sense for the value of getting more people to get vaccinated. It seems that focusing on the unobservable reactions and mechanisms the vaccine sets off in the body is not going to be the most productive. Instead, it would be more productive to just focus on the it works and it's safe part of things. Of course, I'm oversimplifying the scenario here. As Maya Goldenberg has persuasively argued, vaccine hesitancy is rooted much more in a lack of trust than a lack of knowledge. So first, advisors and policymakers would have to engage in trust building with the public. But I think it is safe to say that an empirical stance will play a big role here. Not just the part about focusing on experience and observation, but also the more general respect and admiration for science. We're here talking about an epistemic stance, but for an ultimately pragmatic aim, which is to keep people healthy. Insofar as this is based on reflection and sound arguments, I don't see why this shouldn't be considered a philosophical stance. Now, we can also talk about science practitioners, as several advocates for scientific realism have argued in the philosophy of science literature. Arthur Fine immediately comes to mind. If the scientist has to feel at home with the kind of theoretical entities that she or he's working with, a realist attitude or a realist stance would make the most sense. Otherwise, it's probably going to be disorienting. So that's a familiar argument that's been made many times in the in the scientific realism literature. Pierre Duhem had a similar view. He thought that accepting, or I don't know if you use the word belief, I guess, as a placeholder, I'm going to use the word believe. Duhem said, believing that physical theory eventually converges to a natural classification of empirical laws is pragmatically beneficial for him to feel motivated to carry on with his pursuit of science. Right, so there have been such pragmatic arguments made for a realist stance. What if we were pluralists rather than monists about stances? So that's where I'm ultimately going. Another example I want to talk about is a science teacher. While I think science education should mirror scientific practice to the extent possible, and convey the message that science has multiple aims, operates in multiple contexts, and so on, I think a realist stance would make the most sense in a number of educational contexts. By realist stance, I don't mean a stance that involves the claim that science solely or primarily aims at truth, but what I mean is taking a positive epistemic attitude toward the objects of the theories under study. If the pedagogical goal is mastery of a theory, then a realist attitude on the part of the teacher would be more suitable in order to not lead students to develop some kind of a cognitive dissonance. Moreover, if science education is to mirror scientific practice, it makes sense to create a classroom environment, when discussing, let's say, Newtonian mechanics, where everyone behaves like, what it says is literally true. Of course, the teacher can, and arguably should, reveal that the theory is false when the time is appropriate, but this claim or proposition is compatible with having an overall realist stance. So, recall that a stance is not characterized just by, a single proposition or a claim. So, as is probably, clear by now, I want to ask if, what if we were pluralists rather than monists about stances? So Van Frazen sees stances as something quite basic and perhaps immutable, not immutable, perhaps. He does talk about conversion and, you can change your stance. But why can't we actively embrace multiple stances, multiple even, not incompatible stances, with the perspective of, each stance is suited, well suited to a certain goal. So, I'm not talking about pluralists in the sense of, you have your stance and I have mine, but a more robust sense of multiple stances. Multiple stances make complete sense to me in different contexts and with respect to different aims. And I myself would adopt and embrace your stance if I were in your position, right? So that's the kind of pluralism that I'm trying to go for. So I'm looking at, basically pluralism in epistemology for the sake of other pursuits like policymaking or teaching. And what I recommend here is, a Changian, Hassop Chang talks about, a pluralistic attitude towards scientific theories. And he has this view that he calls an active normative epistemic pluralism. So active meaning actively, embrace and, actively encourage pluralism and embrace different theories. Normative meaning, that is the way to go, epistemic pluralism. So I think adopting a similar pluralistic attitude towards stances would be helpful. So, I mean, we can talk about epistemology for its own sake. I'm not sure if there is such a thing as belief for belief's sake. But the choice of epistemology as a goal can be seen as pragmatic, but it's not, for instance, epistemology for policy or epistemology for education. When we're talking about, Van Frazen's or Chakravarti's approaches, they're epistemology for its own sake, but that seems to be the only goal on their radar. So I'm just wondering if we can if we can have a more robust pluralistic attitude where epistemology for its own sake is just seen as one of the goals, and then we can also have other goals in whose service epistemology can be, right? So epistemology in the service of various pragmatic goals. So, thank you.